I'm sorry for the delay in recording videos. I had an eye allergy and couldn't really read much or expose myself to computer or videos. And then we were having this international virtual conference, so I had to really save my eyesight for that. So that's the reason for the delay. I'm sorry for that, and I didn't want to throw stuff without giving you proper information. Now, today we are discussing what the topic is: the colonial legacy, the history of international journalism. I decided to have chapter 3 before chapter 2. Although in chronological order it falls otherwise, like first you read about the historical importance of the colonial legacy, and then you see how it fits into our modern narrative. But I think it's important to first know things that are current, because as a journalism student, normally we are not interested in knowing what was in the past, but rather we would like to connect it to something that we know about the present, something that is working right now. And that was the reason. The colonial legacy, as the very word tells us, is representative of a system, of a political system, which was earlier than our national independence, and we are part of what we call post-colonial societies, which are controlled still mentally by somehow the hegemony of the former masters, and at present the hegemony of the information systems. So for that very reason, it's really important to understand what were the roots of the information system that led to news agencies, and also what were the intentions. I would really like to quote something from this chapter, which is really interesting. This is almost at the end of the chapter, and it's a quote from another book, which is there in the Williams book. And I'm quoting, "The Western press has since decolonization acted as a sort of international monitoring agency whose inspectors, foreign correspondents, tour the third world to measure how far away from proper standards Asian and African societies have fallen, and right-wing, liberal and left-wing reporters and news organizations share at least one attribute: the notion that it is their role to judge and apportion praise, if any, and blame." And that's true. You look at the way the Western press behaves still. And I would like to quote another thing. This is the way they behave right now. And how did they see us? As we see, it began in somehow the first news, foreign news came in the 17th century. But the formal system of information gathering started somewhere in the 18th century. And then came the news agencies, the French Havas, the British Reuters, and so these were the most important ones. The Americans came later after the First World War. They replaced the British mainly because they got control of the Latin American information system through giving them news. So the British and the French didn't have much influence then in Latin America. They were confined to the continent, and somehow the Americans also took control of the continent, right? As we see right now, Europe and the US, the Great Britain. I don't know how the name is, but it's England. So the first and foremost impression: why did people the early news gatherers, what were they seeking? First and foremost, we must understand that unlike today, gathering international news was sometimes, most of the time, easier than gathering domestic news, because domestic news in the times of kings and despots was not easy, and so there were a lot of checks and balances. Whereas, as they call themselves, they were kind of early explorers. They just went into different countries and said, "This is what we saw," and these were kind of tales from a distant land. These were practically stories, like they were telling stories. Most of the accounts of the foreign lands in the 18th century were kind of fairy tale accounts, adjective laden, and then somehow they were connected to the mindset of the empire. So each and every news gatherer somehow was representing the dominance of their own people over the colonized. And here is what I would like to quote again. David Livingstone in Africa in 1869 returned to Britain to tell the Manchester Chamber of Commerce of the potential market opportunity that existed in the New World meaning Africa. There are 50 million of people beyond the gateway to the Congo, and the cotton spinners of Manchester are waiting to clothe them. Birmingham foundries are glowing with the red metals that presently will be made into ironwork for them, and the trinkets that shall adorn their dusky bosoms, and the ministers of Christ are zealous to bring them, the poor benighted heathens, into the Christian fold. This is what we know as the mental legalization of colonial oppression. Like, oppression was transformed into a sacred act by saying that the white man has Christianity, and the white man, even when they enslaved the other people like blacks in Africa or snake charmers in India or any other part of the world, they were in fact doing them a favor by bringing them to the lights of Christianity, to the lights of civilization. And that is the most important thing to understand when we try to understand the colonial legacy. It was there and it still persists. It's a kind of hypocrisy that never goes away. You can look at the account of the 18th century, 19th century, or today. They were always looked down upon, the past colonies. Somehow the Western mind has not been able to emancipate itself from the idea of their dominance over others, like people like us. And that's the way the whole system works. There are a few points that are discussed in here, and I would like to go through them. Like, basically, as I said, the first news published in the 17th century, and it was considered to be what we call a cultural exploration. And one important point is that the earlier war during the medieval era between the Christians and others, mostly Muslims, had a great impact upon the European mind. And journey into these lands was also always considered to be kind of a twofold mission. One, seeing what's there, so this charm of knowing the unknown, and also humanizing the savage. And this was a dual role that most of these journalists, news gatherers played. Somehow within the colonial context, the West tended to, like, it was the Orient, as Edward Said said, always had kind of given an exotic image of the lands who were outside the Western colonial powers' original homelands. Like all the colonies were somehow, or people who were supposed to be colonized, who were waiting to be colonized and humanized in the eyes of the Western powers, the colonial powers. So there was a sacred mission, although they were just like shamelessly and hypocritically talking about civilizing the people while they were really exploiting them. And this always remained a very important component of what we call international journalism. So we see that almost at the end of the 18th, or like the mid 18th century, 19th century, we are getting something that is from news gathering to what we see as news. And here there is a great role of technology because the invention of basically telegraph and the introduction of telegraph had a great role to play. And the cost of sending a telegram was kind of £1 a word, which was too much from India to England. So most of the time, there is this question of objectivity, because they said only facts can travel. Like, they used to write as many words as were important to give facts. So the facts-based objective account of news was not because there was some change of attitude, but because there were financial constraints upon writing longer stories. The longer impressions of colonial experience in countries like ours were left to book writings, and all the imaginary rights and wrongs were basically part of book writing, since it was not feasible to invest in longer features. So they remain kind of factual, because it was not simply gathering news, but rather selling news was also difficult, because you have to somehow sell it to somebody. Like there were two buyers of news. One of those were financial news buyers, basically bankers, investors, people like that. And then there were kind of local British newspapers, if we take the account of Reuters, the most important one at that time. And the local newspapers who didn't have any long-stay correspondents in countries like India or Egypt or whatever, or any Latin American country, they didn't have any opportunity to send correspondents. They didn't have that much money. So they were dependent upon the news that was coming through news agencies. And those news agencies had these two potential buyers. The one usually gave them money. The other bought their services. So the ones who were buying their services needed really succinct information to use in their local newspapers to keep people interesting. These and the facts were not facts in the sense that they were true, because truth never mattered. It was not important at that time, because nobody was worried about what was going on in India, whether people were dying of famine or whatever was happening. What people were interested was, it was kind of more of a human interest story to tell something about an exotic land beyond the confines of their daily routines, and that's what they did. So to most of them, and then when it became a form of news, the way we see it right now, there were three elements kind of. First and foremost, it was speed. How quick can you give them? And trustworthiness and usefulness. So is it useful for a local newspaper? Is there enough spice in it or bite in it to be sold to a local British newspaper? because if they are not interested, you are just sending news for nothing. And this also brings us to the point that news agencies, they never had an independent existence. So they had to earn money somehow, and that money came from the empire. Most of the time they were kind of representing the British Empire or the French imperial interests or any others. This is what they were doing. And most of the time there was a lot of connection between the diplomatic or administrative structure, colonial structure in the colonies and the news agencies. So news agencies were basically the ones who furthered the interest of the empire by creating an image of a country which the British or any other colonial masters ruled, and they used to instill that image in their own country, because it was very important that these newly emerging democratic societies should always know that everything that they are doing is for the good of everybody. People knew that there is no good for others, but they always wanted to make sure that this facade of righteousness is there, because somehow they were agents of civilization. And it's also interesting the way the settler press interacted with news agencies. Like settlers was those people who came from the colonial headquarters, like countries like from Britain or Holland or Portugal, and they settled in India. For example, the Dutch missionaries in Srirampur were the ones who were also doing journalism in local languages. So this was the settler press, and that settler press in the 18th century and the late 17th century was also a source of information for the news agencies. And somehow the news agency staff, local staff, was so much dependent upon news from those local newspapers that they seldom used to write an original story. They were just copying stories from local newspapers and sending those in their own languages to their home countries. This is a practice that is still there, and most of those journalists, international journalists who come to Pakistan, for example, they get into local media and they see if they can read a language, they can simply get a story, get it translated, or just take it, or from the English press, from a local English daily, and they'll just publish it without changing anything and without giving any credit to the local journalists. This is the practice that is still going on. So we can also see some similarities between then and now. Most of the international news agency staffers were not journalists, right? Because most of these people were considered to be the person with the right contacts at the ground than the person with journalistic skills. This became a problem later in the 40s when there were more knowledge about what was going on in the world, and wars and everything gave a different understanding of the world. So news agencies started to give more of a realistic account of what was going on and sending trained journalists to the field, and all these things were happening. But it's very important to understand that the system of information that we see in the shape of the news agencies was basically a money-making model. It was not a kind of a humanistic enterprise that most of the people think that such journalists are really representing us in their own country. They don't do that. This is not their job. This is not why they are here. And if you are into that system, you will know that this is never their intention. Yes, they know how to exploit sympathies, they understand your culture, they have a good study of your culture, and they'll represent whatever benefits them.